Hi there folks, well, welcome back to my channel, and for this video I'm going to be looking at a reselection of some of my favourite Scottish novels, and I do have a wee pile here that I will be going through in a minute. Before I get onto that, some housekeeping first. If you're enjoying my channel, if you're enjoying my videos, if you can click on that subscriber button, click on that notification bell, leave some likes, leave some comments, it's always really appreciated. And if you'd like to support the channel further, I will post a link to my channelscoffee.com page in the description bar below, and then a pinned comment in the comments section. So with that out of the road, with that done and dusted, on to the main topic of this video. So these are some of, but not all of, my favourite Scottish novels. And to begin with, this is one that is by an author that people might not realise was Scottish. And the book that I'm going to be talking about for this bit is The Hound of the Baskervilles by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. So Arthur Conan Doyle was actually born in Edinburgh and actually ended up going to Edinburgh University, where he met someone called Dr. Joseph Bell, who became one of the main influences for the character of Sherlock Holmes. And yeah, I have noticed over the past few while that when I've been thinking about the books that I tend to enjoy, the books that I tend to read and pick up, even though they are all from different genres, they can be on different topics, different subjects. One thing that tends to be in all of them is the fact that there is a certain level of the gothic, certain level of darkness, and there's that kind of sense of kind of maybe a certain level of foreboding maybe as well. And it's definitely something that you do find in The Hound of the Baskervilles, even though it is about a detective, and even though Sherlock Holmes is known for being very scientific and logical and thinks everything through, there is always this kind of feeling and sense of there is this kind of scientific element or this supernatural element to the story, which I actually really enjoy. And I love the way that within The Hound of the Baskervilles, Conan Doyle does balance it really well, that you are just kind of walking that fine line of what's going on, like is this going to be the one case that Holmes doesn't crack. But again, I think most of us probably do know the story of The Hound of the Baskervilles and how it all kind of pans out, but it's still one of those books that I think I read this when I was about 16, 17 years old. So a wee while ago, that was the first time I read it, and it, as like so many of my favourite books, this one is overdue a reread. And so yeah, that is the first book in my little list. Okay, this list is not in like any specific order, it's just kind of an order of the books that I picked up. But yeah, that is definitely one of my staples, is The Hound of the Baskervilles. And the next book that I'm going to be talking about is maybe not a book that a lot of people know about. I think it might be becoming more popular, more people might be becoming more aware of it now. But it's the full title is The Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner. Alright, I think a lot of people do refer to it as Confessions of a Justified Sinner, or Justified Sinner, or just Confessions. But it's by an author called James Hogg, who was roughly contemporary with Walter Scott, I think. And I first read this when I was 18, and I think I'd gotten like about halfway through, or like 3/4 of the way through or something, and I was just utterly confused, didn't know what was going on, where the book was going. And it wasn't until one of my lecturers actually explained it to me and said, like, you are supposed to be confused, you are supposed to be wondering what the hell is going on. I went back and reread it and totally fell in love with it, because when I realised how you were supposed to read it, I just went, something just clicked, the penny dropped, and I just went, no, okay, this is one of my favourites now. And I think the part of the reason why I was getting confused with it was the fact that the way it was written, that Hogg, again, is having a reader sitting questioning and wondering whether the main character, who's called Robert Ringham, whether he is mentally ill or whether he's actually being possessed by the devil. And yeah, and it's just one of those kind of books where, because it's the fact that it's been told by two unreliable narrators. So you've got the editor, who is telling the story from the point of view of second and third hands information that he's gotten from people who have heard of what happened. And you also have the bit that's being told from the point of view of Robert Ringham, the main character. And because he's either mentally ill or he's being possessed by the devil, he's not a reliable narrator. He's kind of got he's either not completely with it and these are all hallucinations, or he's under the control and influence of a malignant force, so you can't really believe what he says either. So you're pretty much relying on where both narratives and kind of overlay and come into contact, and they both back each other up. But there's different bits where you just sit going, where you do sit and have to kind of question what's going on. But I think that even though it may be confusing, it also makes it a compelling read. And again, there is definitely a darkness to Confessions. There is this level of the gothic and just kind of never being quite sure what's going on. And I could find it once I kind of got my head around how the book was written, it definitely just drew me in. And yeah, and again, I probably do need to sit down and actually just reread it and get through it again, because it's been far too long since I read that one. And the next one, this is actually the first book that Christopher Brookmyre ever had published. And I think he's now professionally going by Chris Brookmyre. So if you see books that are by an author called Chris Brookmyre, it's the same guy. And this was the first book he ever had published. And even though I do love a lot of his books, and I do love a lot of what he's come out with, this one will always be my favourite. So it's quite ugly one morning. And what I actually really like about the way Christopher Brookmyre writes this book, and how he writes a lot of his books, is that even though he is pretty much writing in standard English, you can still hear the Scottish accent with the Scottish characters. And it's just the way he kind of uses the language and uses phrases. And it very much does kind of give a very strong Scottish feel to his texts and to his books. And yeah, and it's again the fact that kind of it's just with Christopher Brookmyre, he doesn't hold any punches. He's one of those kind of writers that, okay, may not be as grotesque in some things as some other writers, but the fact that the book essentially starts with a police inspector going into a crime scene, and they find essentially a turd sitting on top of a mantelpiece while there's a dead body lying in the middle of the living in the middle of the living room floor. Yeah, you realise it's not gonna be kind of pretty in places. But I did still find Quite Ugly One Morning. It's a really compelling read, and it's just, I love the humour, I love the way he uses language, and I love the way he uses dialogue, and it definitely has a really strong Scottish feel to it, which I think kind of just does add to the whole kind of like humour and this like darkness within the text. And yeah, so I would definitely recommend, if you want to read a book or read any books that have a really strong Scottish feel, definitely get some of Christopher Brookmyre's books. And The next book I'm going to be reading, or the next book I'm going to be looking at, is a book that I'd actually read when I was at university. And it was one of the other books by this author was the book on the syllabus, but I decided that I'd try and read. No, this was the one that was in the syllabus. I'd gotten his other books as well and tried to kind of read through them as much as I could before the course started. So the book that I'm going to be talking about, which is one of my favourites by this author, is The Bridge by Ian Banks. And for those who also know, Ian Banks also wrote under the name of Ian M. Banks, and that was his sci-fi stuff. And he wrote using the name Ian Banks for his more mainstream stuff. But even though like things like The Bridge and The Business and The Wasp Factory are seen as being Ian Banks' mainstream books, they're definitely not kind of mainstream. They're just, it's, with Banks there is a lot of darkness to his books. I think that actually seems to be a kind of common theme in a lot of Scottish fiction. There is this kind of darkness. I don't know if it's maybe the fact that it gets dark in Scotland for half the year. It's like during the winter it can get fairly dark and gloomy, and it's it's just like, I just try to explain it. It's just that kind of, so the whole premise of The Bridge is essentially, it's kind of in two worlds almost. There's the conscious physical world that we all live in, but there's also this world that the main character essentially has created for himself, because he essentially is kind of in a coma, so he's kind of in his own mind, and he creates a world of The Bridge, and essentially it's him trying to kind of almost disentangle everything that's going on and try to figure out what is actually happening, and because he has no memory of life outside of the world of The Bridge, and he sometimes get these kind of flashes of what's going on outside, and it's just the way that Banks wrote the book, the way he just uses the text, it's just really intriguing. It pulls you in, and you're constantly just wanting to find out what's happening and what's going to happen next, and it's one of those kind of ones that you just sit and you read. It just kind of takes you along on just an amazing ride. And again, it's just one of those stories that's just really, really intriguing. And you can tell this is the book that I actually had at uni, because it's just like filled with my scribbles and notes and just kind of passages that I'd underlined and was using for quotes from my essay. And it's just one of those good books that it's like, it just reminds me of kind of like the happy shouldn't days. But that is definitely one book that I would always recommend to anyone, especially if they're wanting to kind of find some good Scottish fiction, is definitely The Bridge by Ian Banks. And I was actually lucky enough to meet Ian Banks a couple of times when he did the I Write Festival in Glasgow. And a really nice man, always really friendly, was always willing to chat to folk. And I'm trying to find where it is, because I think this one of the times went to see him, I'd brought along my copy of The Algebraist, which is one of his sci-fi books, and just try to find it. Managed to get him to sign it for me. So I've actually got a signed copy of a book by Ian Banks. So that's kind of got a wee kind of pride of place up in my bookshelf. And again, this is something else that I read when I was at uni, because part of my undergrad course, which was archaeology and Scottish literature, which apparently I wasn't supposed to do, but I managed to kind of wrangle it. And one of the, it's actually 3 books we had to read. It was a trilogy called A Scots Queer, which is also known as the Mearns trilogy, as by Lewis Grassic Gibbon. And for those who don't know, the Mearns is up kind of Aberdeenshire way. It's got kind of like Montrose, St Cyrus, that kind of like Stonehaven, that kind of area. So something like kind of the east coast of Scotland. Really beautiful part of the country, really beautiful part of the world. It's somewhere that I do actually want to go up and explore more, and because I've managed to go up there briefly for a couple of days, and yeah, and it's just a really beautiful area. And essentially the Scots Queer does centre around one character called Chris Guthrie, and it's very much kind of looking, especially in the first book, which is called Sunset Song, which is probably the most famous book of the trilogy, and essentially looks at her connection to the land, her growing into womanhood, and it's kind of one of those good books, was one of those good trilogies. It is very much set in the landscape. It is very much set in the part of Scotland where it's set, and with Gibbon very much used, even though it was kind of pretty much standard English that was used within the text, it does very much kind of give an impression or a feel for the language that is used up in that area, which is Doric, which is actually another language in Scotland. People always know that it's English and it's kind of Scots English and Gaelic that are spoken in Scotland, but there's also Doric, which is spoken up in the Aberdeenshire area. And even though it's not written in Doric, you do get the feel and the flavour and the flow of how Doric is spoken, how it's used. And that's kind of one of the things that I really loved about how Lewis Grassic Gibbon wrote this. Again, it just gives you that feel and the sense of where it's set, of the language, of the people, of the countryside. And yeah, so as is not just one book I'd recommend. It's like if you're going to be reading a Sunset Song, I would definitely recommend reading the whole trilogy. And I think you can get Sunset Song sold separately, but you can get all 3 in one bound book. So I would definitely recommend that. And again, I am so overdue just sitting down and reading all these books again. It's just the joy of having to try and find the time. So hopefully you will all have been intrigued by my little collection, or my little selection of Scottish novels. Hopefully you will maybe all be intrigued enough to actually go out and treat yourself to some copies of these books, and to sit down and enjoy a really good read of Scottish fiction. And yeah, and again, I will definitely at some point sit down and read through all these books and treat myself to books that I have loved for years. So hopefully you will have enjoyed this video, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye bye.